Cecilia Rikap, welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. It's a great pleasure to have an opportunity to ask you questions about the diagnosis of digital markets, maybe description of the situation, digital markets in Europe primarily, but maybe also in other jurisdictions. And maybe I'll also ask you whether it matters which jurisdiction we're talking about. But describing the markets themselves is very important. I also wanted to maybe ask your remedies, your solutions to the to systemic challenges and turbulences we all experience, and also to learn more about the stakes, how important, why we bother, why we keep discussing these issues, and how significant, how high profile the stakes are. You are very convincing and eloquent speaker, contributing to so many different discussions. And I wanted to start with inviting you maybe to provide to us the explanation, your vision of the importance of digital markets today and tomorrow.
Well, first of all, hi Oles, thanks for having me here. I'm very happy to be here, and I think that the topics that you're interested in, which are also part of the focus of my research, are extremely relevant. But allow me to start by flipping a bit the conversation, in the sense that I think that instead of speaking about digital markets, we need to speak about digital ecosystems. We need to speak about digital networks. And one of the problems that competition and market authorities and governments more broadly are facing today is that they are still using the markets playbook, a playbook that thinks of markets as separated units, which actually, I'm an economist by training, and in economics, you even from the mainstream scholars, you get these two different views. One view that says that you can just isolate the market and analyze the market dynamics as if nothing else mattered. But there is also, again, I insist, even within the mainstream, and of course, in more critical takes within economics, there is also a view of markets as interconnected institutions, as interconnected spaces. And in that view, it doesn't make sense to look at one market as an isolated unit or space, because what happens in market A will be impacting on markets C, D, B, and E. And if we want to understand the logic of market A, we also need to understand what's going on with the other markets at the same time. So to some extent, is not that from a research point of view, what we're looking at is completely new, or we don't have any tools to make sense of it. Nonetheless, I think that from a regulatory perspective, what has happened is a process in which competition and market authorities, antitrust authorities, were not really understanding these interconnections and how relevant they are to understand power, to understand economic power. And the fact that economic power today is not necessarily exercised in the form of a market monopoly. And I think that this is an angle in which my research distinguishes itself from that of other people that perhaps come more strictly from the competition policy research, because as an economist, I've originally focused more on economics of innovation. And in particular, one thing that I think I've been contributing to is this understanding of a different type of monopoly, what I describe as an intellectual monopoly. So what is monopolized is not a specific market, but knowledge, intangibles, and also data. And if we try to apply this idea of a company that is systematically capturing more intangibles, and capturing is a keyword here, because it means that that knowledge, those intangibles, the data, may not necessarily be produced exclusively inside the company's R&D laboratory. You can have an intellectual monopoly as those of the past. Think of IBM in the 1970s, for instance, or 1960s. IBM was a vertically integrated company, and that included also a huge R&D laboratory. And inside the laboratory, IBM was transforming its R&D, its new knowledge, its creations into assets, primarily using patents. And with those patents, it was able to exercise its power and determine the market conditions in which it was going to exchange with not only final users, but also other companies. Eventually, IBM and many other leading corporations in the world started forming what the literature now describes as global value chains. And there we can see a form of already interconnection, a clearer interconnection among different markets, where the interconnection is not one just of symmetric or powerless market exchanges, but one in which the leading corporation is capable of planning, of controlling beyond ownership, and organizing to some extent other markets and defining not only the price at which it's going to buy, but also the price at which it's going to sell. So really has this unique capacity to control production processes beyond ownership. And that includes becoming a market setter, not only when it sells, but also when it buys. That is an example that is useful for us for thinking about what's going on in digital, because in digital, we have a similar dynamic. We have leading corporations that are the established hierarchical core of the ecosystem. And then we have a turbulent and big set of satellite actors that are contributing not only to the production of the digital services or digital products, but also are contributing to the creation of knowledge, to the creation of data. And to some extent, we can think also of individual users as contributing to the production of this digital ecosystem with our data. Today is more obvious with the interaction with generative AI models, where our prompts continue training the model and improving the model. So ultimately, I think that what my research contributes to in this analysis of digital markets is to shape the conversation towards an analysis of digital ecosystems, digital networks, and to emphasize that there are certain companies that are occupying bottleneck positions that have a panopticon capacity to see what everyone is doing and planning beyond ownership the digital services that then people consume on their everyday lives, as well as organizations, from governments to other companies.
Okay, and can you also explain the stakes? How important digital ecosystems are in creating global value or in this global supply chain, and how rapidly their presence is increasing, and why it matters so much for today and for tomorrow again?
Absolutely. So, of course, this dynamic that I'm describing is a dynamic that, again, I was making this parallel with global value chains, and these global value chains still exist. So we have Toyota controlling many other companies, or Renault, or we have the big pharma companies that also control beyond ownership the production of new drug discoveries that more often than not are produced inside the universities, inside or together with the startup companies, and then the big pharma captures most of the profits. So why is it that digital is so important? And I think that there we need to look exactly at what is it that it's produced inside these digital ecosystems. Digital is today's information and communication technologies. We as individuals, organizations, countries, so national economies, everyone needs information in order to organize our existence, in order to govern. When I'm speaking, for instance, of the global value chains, the way in which Toyota is able to control beyond ownership what all the other companies are doing, the suppliers, subcontractors, sometimes it is by going physically to the other offices or to the manufacturing facilities of its suppliers, but it's also and more primarily through information systems. It is by controlling who does what and who knows what, capturing information. And these information systems are basically digital technologies. And this is just one example of the many, because inside every organization, think for instance of governments, think of the state, the healthcare systems, education systems, defense, state's everyday operation, whatever you look at, everything depends on information in order to function, in order to work. We are having this conversation through a digital tool. So more and more inside everything that we look at, information becomes more critical. And when we say information, today it means harvesting big data and having a capacity to analyze that data with algorithms, which more and more are the most sophisticated AI algorithms. Sometimes they might be generative AI, but there are many other machine learning models that are also being used to making sense of this data and information. So this is why when we look at the concentration of power within digital ecosystems, this concentration matters more than the concentration in other sectors. It is because the concentration in this sector is also capable of influencing and even controlling the leaders of the other sectors. Big pharma companies become more dependent on digital technologies that are controlled beyond ownership by big tech companies. Because with these digital technologies, a big pharma company can, one, organize its value chain. Two, drug development more and more is depending on this method, quote unquote, one could say method of invention, that is processing a lot of data with artificial intelligence. So, and the same can be said of every industry. And the same again happens with governments. And there is an extra reason why this formation of intellectual monopolies in the digital sector is particularly relevant. And this is because the technology by itself gets better the more it's used. So it intrinsically has a dynamic that leads to what sometimes is being described as the winner takes all, which can also be interpreted as a particular form of natural monopoly, where, let's face it, it's better to have only Google as a search engine, because Google will, its algorithms, with all our searches there, the algorithm becomes better and better, so the results become better. And also from an individual standpoint, it's better to just know that you need to go to one place and ask your question there instead of going to 10 places and then deciding whether the answer of place number 1, 5, or 6 was better. But this means that we are all together as a society producing these algorithms. And when I say it, it's not just about the fact that we are all collectively creating data. It's also that the knowledge that is being used, that the algorithms themselves are not just produced by the companies, but in what I describe as corporate innovation networks, where thousands of universities, public research organizations, startup companies are participating, are co-creating knowledge. And one can see this, for instance, when one looks at the co-authorship of papers by big tech companies, how in the case of Microsoft, for instance, almost 9 out of 10, every 10 papers that Microsoft publishes, and Microsoft in total publishes thousands of papers year after year. But if we think of a sort of simple descriptive statistic of this story, from 10 papers published by Microsoft, around 9 have co-authors that are people working at other organizations, which means that 90, in a way, if we want to make the generalization, almost 90% of the knowledge that then is privatized by Microsoft is co-developed with other organizations. And I say knowledge that then is privatized by Microsoft because when one compares this type of collaboration with the patents, there is no collaboration in terms of co-ownership of patents. 1% of Microsoft patents is co-owned with organizations that are not Microsoft. So definitely this sector, this ecosystem exhibits what I describe as a form of knowledge extractivism. And this form of knowledge extractivism is essential for the self-reinforcement of Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and so on intellectual monopolies. And because of the centrality of the type of intangible assets that these companies are controlling and are preventing us from accessing freely, because you may be able to access to your own personal data, but nobody but them will get access to the whole data set. You might be able to get access to a piece of technology when they put it in open source, but they are the only ones that keep the whole puzzle. And precisely by sometimes arguing that they are contributing to public knowledge, to open source, they reinforce their power without putting in danger their intellectual monopoly at all. These companies are constantly contributing to open source, and they do so as a way to generate more loyalty from the community, to make their pieces of software the de facto standard in the industry. So this is very tricky because, again, regulators are not used to these dynamics, are not used to seeing an intellectual monopoly that at the same time is opening pieces of its own created knowledge. And it seems to be a way to level the playing field, but it's exactly the other way around. And when they offer a service for free to people out there through their platforms, again, it's completely contradictory to the ways in which regulators, antitrust authorities have been looking at market power abuses. And this is because this is a different species. This is different from the all robber barons or whatever comparison one wants to make with previous forms of concentrated corporate power. And for me, the key distinction is this unique capacity to control beyond ownership. And when this control beyond ownership is exercised on the very basic and fundamental piece of knowledge that everyone needs in order to make sense of their experience, their lives, in order to produce, in order to govern ultimately, because information technologies are the key for processing information for governments as well, then what is at stake is who rules, who governs our society, who makes the rules. And then it seems that we are all in a more interconnected and open space, but it's a space in which the rules were decided in a completely undemocratic way behind closed doors, but by a few corporate giants. So I think that ultimately what is at stake is democracy, our capacity to have institutions that are with democratically elected representatives that are the ones that make the decisions. Because in order to make decisions, even for these representatives, they will need information and information technologies. And more, these are provided and therefore defined, determined by these huge big tech companies.
I will pretend that I didn't get the answer to my next question, but I think the last part of your comment alluded to the position to the question which I want to ask. At the juncture of this conversation, I would see two exits, two conclusions. We are not even at the peak of the conversation, but two conclusions in terms of what to do. The first one is more a kind of ideological and borderless, universal, and many might say idealistic. That it's a disagreement with how the system, how societies are being organized, with this kind of the gene is out, and you have to be paranoid in order to try to squeeze it back. But there are somehow the regulatory responses and broader societal responses must be more coordinated, more proactive, etc., etc. And this is kind of a joint exercise of all of us. That's the solution one. And solution B, that it is pretty much we see many ecosystem, digital and non-digital, playing by the same rule book. And it looks that it's the only way for them to evolve, to expand, to become omnipresent and to increase their influence. And thus, it's not about a borderless kind of universal humanity. It's about a new kind of tool in the continuous game, continuous race between jurisdictions, between societies, where it is to some extent a zero-sum game, where it's better to have your own bad guys, it's better to have your own digital ecosystem and any ecosystems rather than be exploited and somehow colonized by other digital ecosystems. I imagine that there is probably something true in both solutions, but who am I? Let me ask you to provide an answer if there is an answer to this.
So let's start by the latter. Let's start by China. So what has China done before? And this is important because we need to have the context clear. Before the companies became dominant inside China, which is no longer the case in most of the countries around the world. So the feasibility of the Chinese story it's unique to that moment in time and unique to China's characteristics. But leaving for 1 second that behind and focusing on the Chinese case, when the Chinese government saw that at that time that companies like eBay, for instance, were entering its market, and that there were already some Chinese alternatives, but they were very small and couldn't compete, the Chinese government, of course, decided that the way forward was to block foreign companies and to leave a space for local companies to grow. That was not only done through the Great Firewall, that it's still there and prevents, unless you have a VPN, prevents the use of many of the services and platforms of US big tech companies and other large tech companies. But also, the Chinese government invested huge amounts of money in infrastructure, in enabling the big tech from China to offer their digital services in the first place. Without internet connectivity, there are no potential users, because even if people would like to adopt these services without being connected to the internet, it wouldn't have worked. So the Chinese government was operating at this double front, blocking, but also investing locally to make sure that the companies could, on top of that, offer their platforms and services. We fast forward to today, and it's true, definitely true, that the only potential rivals to US big tech companies are Chinese big tech. But they operate in the exact same way as US big tech companies. They also control beyond ownership. They also influence and steer the research that is done by startup companies that are sometimes receive investment money from the big tech from China, such as Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei. And with this investment, the Chinese big tech companies also get privileged access to the knowledge that the startups are developing. This is exactly the same thing that US big tech companies do with the startups from the rest of the world. They invest, and with that investment as corporate venture capitals, they get privileged access to the technology that the startups are developing. So they can use that knowledge, they can use those technologies for free or through the investment, but can have complete access to that knowledge. And at the same time, can steer the knowledge, can redirect the startup towards what? Toward things that are of the interest of the big tech in two respects. One, to then get access to that knowledge and keep on reinforcing their own intellectual monopoly, but also making sure that the startup only does a tiny bit of the whole ecosystem so that the intellectual monopoly, the big tech, can still be in power. This dynamic is exactly the same in the US and in China. It is also the same dynamic, and even a dynamic that is more openly accepted, the fact that Chinese big tech use the knowledge that is developed by Chinese universities, specifically, but also by universities from other parts of the world, for instance, very close allies like universities from Singapore. And it's true at the same time that the result, one could say, oh, okay, but China did it. But China did it for whom? Who is really benefiting from the fact that China has big tech companies? And the answer is Jack Ma and all the other executives from these companies, the Chinese government. But is it really that the Chinese people are being favored by this form of extended surveillance society? Because also the fact that these big companies exist, they are a double channel of communication with the Chinese government. In the US, there are stories of how US big tech companies ended up providing users' data to the National Security Agency. But one would think that this is not an everyday story, whereas in China, it's completely accepted that this is how it happens. And in part, through the data that the state harvests from the citizens, Chinese big tech and small startups were able to develop their models. So really, it's a very unequal society anyway at the level of who can get true access to knowledge and information in the digital ecosystem, and also in terms of who profits. So the increasing inequality in China needs to be understood as a story of the emergence of intellectual monopolies in China. So it's true that from a geopolitical perspective, for the Chinese government, for Xi Jinping, for the Communist Party, it's better to have Chinese big tech. But also it's a risk. It's a risk for the citizens, for the population in China. It's at the expense of more inequality. And also, it is dangerous for the Chinese government. Because who ends up being in power when the critical technologies for governing are in the hands of private companies? In the case of China, the Chinese government has been more active in trying to limit the power of these companies. And you may remember when they decided to hold Ant Group's second IPO and the effect that that had globally, because Chinese big tech companies a few years ago were among the top 10, like Alibaba and Tencent, were among the top 10 companies in the world in market capitalization. And this is no longer the case. And it was through regulatory decisions of the Chinese government that followed. It was not just halting Ant Group's IPO, but also there were decisions that followed. Among them, the financial business of Chinese companies of Chinese big tech needs to have an intermediary, which are the state-owned banks, the state-owned commercial banks. So in a way, the Chinese government decided, okay, you're going to do your business, but you're going to pay me a sort of pseudo tax that will go to my state-owned banks of part of the money that you're making. So we can say they are co-governing, sometimes with clashes of power. And this is clearly what we are seeing today in the US as well. So geopolitically, for China, this alternative of preventing the US companies to enter its market and having its own quote unquote national champions worked. But in terms of the inequalities inside China and in the world, definitely doesn't work. It is very dangerous that a few actors, be them just big companies or be it also that we accept that their governments are now in a coalition or allies with them, so the Chinese government and the US government, for the world, for people in general, for the planet. This is not good news. And this is why I was saying, well, your question ultimately depends on who you are speaking from. If you are a government that only wants geopolitical power and doesn't care about making the life of every single citizen better and more, and opening more democratic spaces for collective governance, and opening and more spaces where people can collectively produce knowledge and use that knowledge. Knowledge is the only product that has its that where the input is the same is also the output, in the sense that knowledge is produced with knowledge. Of course, the resulting knowledge is this it's supposed to be different and better to some extent of the input of knowledge that was used in order to produce it. But if we curtail access to knowledge, we're also curtailing the possibility for developing new knowledge that can be useful and can be put at the service of, for instance, solving wicked problems of our time. And think again of the ecological crisis. So I definitely think that the solution is not isolation, is not techno-nationalism, is not trying to get a country's own national champions that then will be expanding asymmetries and inequalities on the rest of the system, not only on the citizens, but also on the other companies that become satellites and subordinates, now not of, let's say, a US giant, but of a Chinese giant. So when Europe is thinking about this alternative, I think it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous for society, it's very dangerous for the Europeans, it's very dangerous for the majority of the European companies. The solution shouldn't be becoming a closed society, but also it's impossible to do it. So for me, this is like, let's say you don't care. Let's say you still prefer techno-nationalism and you're the European Commission and you say, I don't care. I just want European giants. You will not make it. So you're making a bet, you're spending taxpayers' money, you're using people's expectations, and you're going to fail. And you're going to fail because there is no other part in the world where we are not already seeing the effect of either US or Chinese big tech. The moment when China did it was a moment when it was feasible to say, okay, you're no longer here, because the companies were only entering the market. It was a moment before the emergence of what Google, Amazon, Meta are today. These companies existed, but they were nothing compared to what they are today. Europe is a continent that breathes through US big tech companies. So the solution cannot be to say, okay, we are putting a great firewall. We are directly saying that these companies will no longer operate here, because it's not feasible from an economic perspective, from a technical perspective, because the companies are already inside Europe at a huge extent. And also geopolitically is unfeasible, because another thing that has changed is that today we have Trump 2.0 in the US. And Trump has been very openly saying again and again that he's not going to tolerate any form of regulation, any form of tax on American tech companies. And it's not just something that he has been saying, but he's also been pushing with the companies for no regulation, no taxes. And we've seen already the result of that. Not only in peripheral countries. I mean, there are some news that say that this type of extortion was already exercised in the trade negotiations with countries like Cambodia and Malaysia. And one would think, okay, this is not new to some extent. The core countries have been controlling the trade agreements with peripheral countries and putting the type of restrictions that were of their will. And this has happened for decades, so it's not new. But what at least needs to be considered to some extent new is that the same is happening with Europe. Is that the fact that the European Union has the AI Act and it has decided that it's not going to enforce it this year for one more year, directly accepting the pressures that come from US big tech and the US government, is further reason why we cannot simply expect that by giving more power to SAP, things will change in Europe. SAP, by the way, is a complicit company. SAP became one of the largest companies in market capitalization in Europe from the moment when SAP decided that it was not going to compete with Amazon, Microsoft, or Google, but to just become a strategic partner offering its ERP and other software, which ultimately is just the ERP, but ERP with different gadgets on Amazon, Microsoft, and Google clouds. So I think that the solution needs to be different. The solution needs to come from understanding what's the center, the core of the power of these companies, in which part of the whole ecosystem they are placed, because it's true that they are everywhere. But it's not the same to be focusing on developing, let's say, different digital services because they offer digital services, which is a very specific layer that is not the one that controls the whole ecosystem, than replacing the companies with public-led solutions where they have the kernel of their power. And this is where I think we need to be thinking of. I don't want to, I know that you will ask me at some point about the solutions, but just to say one word about what this kernel of the power is, this is the cloud, but not the cloud as what people usually associate with the cloud. These days, everybody knows that the cloud is infrastructure as a service. The cloud means data centers, huge data centers that can be scattered, spread around the world, although they are still mostly concentrated in the US. And that these data centers have, among others, GPUs, NVIDIA GPUs, and these NVIDIA GPUs can be accessed as a service, rented as a service through the cloud. But this is a tiny bit of what the cloud really is about. The cloud is a supermarket of digital technologies. And you can think of, we're like, you're in the UK, I live in the UK, but clearly we're recording this in late December, so I'm not in the UK, as people can see. But in the UK, we have Tesco, Carrefour. In Argentina, where I am at the moment, we also have Carrefour, for instance, to speak of other multinational corporations that are all around the world. These are supermarkets of goods that we consume in our everyday lives. The cloud is a supermarket as well, but of digital technologies. Every actor can go and purchase as a service, so can rent, ultimately, whatever digital service, digital technology you can think of. Software, data, models, hardware in different forms, not only GPUs, everything, even consultancies for learning to connect and operate digital services can be rented as a service on the cloud. So everyone that is developing any type of digital solution will find this one-stop shop all where they can get different services that make the development of something new in principle easier, because you don't need to code everything from scratch. You can just code this service that will be doing, for instance, facial recognition, and you need that facial recognition service for a larger cybersecurity piece of software. So instead of developing the code for everything, you start calling services and services that are sold, rented through the cloud. The result is that you're developing a model where you depend on these other services for your code or model to work. This means that every time that you are using it, you will be paying for calling all these services. And let's say that the result is a cybersecurity software. Then you want to sell it. You're a company, you want to sell it. You sell it also on the cloud. So you produce it inside the cloud, which is a very peculiar supermarket. Because typically, if I'm buying, I don't know, whatever, a can of tomato soup in the supermarket, that tomato soup is a product that was manufactured somewhere else, not inside the supermarket. Whereas in the cloud, the digital technologies are produced inside the cloud. The cloud is a developer's platform. It's a platform for developing, for creating the whole architecture of your software. It's also the place where you're purchasing services in order to develop the new piece of software. And it's also the place where you will sell your cybersecurity software to others that will be consuming it inside the cloud. So the cloud is this virtual space with a materiality, of course. We should never forget the materiality, the infrastructure, not only the data centers, but also the undersea cables, the satellites. So that part is critical and it's a strict complementary, but still the cloud is not just that physical infrastructure. It's also this virtual space, this virtual economy to some extent, where production, exchange, and consumption of digital technologies is all intertwined and happens without any possibility of leaving the cloud. And this is the kernel of the power of Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. the fact that everyone producing digital technologies and using digital technologies ends up being compelled to be part of the cloud. So it is here where they are capable of exercising not only a bottleneck power, but also a panopticon power, because they see what organizations from around the world are consuming. It doesn't mean that they will be sneaking into the data that these companies are putting into the cloud. And one needs to make a difference between these two. They, of course, it's forbidden for them to look into the data that one puts in the cloud. I will come back to this anyway in 1 second with something that is called the Cloud Act in the US. But still, in principle, it's illegal to look into the data. But still, when an organization's data is used for and is put inside the cloud and then is analyzed with, for instance, AI models, these AI models will get better by processing data from different organizations. And when this data is on the cloud and an organization starts purchasing services to analyze it, Amazon, Microsoft, or Google, depending on which cloud where this organization is, will know to what extent each and every service offered on the cloud is being rented by each and every organization that is part of the cloud, which means that you can know if the organization is doing better or worse, what type of services are better for a specific industry or type of government. So they have a privileged knowledge on how the world economy is operating ultimately. Before I forget, let me go back to the data issue, because governments around the world are very concerned about data, and they think that data sovereignty is achieved once your data, your country data, is stored inside your territory, inside your country. And this is because the idea of sovereignty historically was associated and almost indistinguishable from territory. Inside your jurisdiction, you govern. Of course, this is no longer the case, and this has never been the case. If you think again, I am in Argentina. I come from a peripheral country. In principle, we are a quote unquote sovereign country, but the influence of the US on Argentina has existed since the US is a world power. So, and before we were a colony, and then we had the influence of the United Kingdom. So really, I mean, in principle, every country in the world is sovereign, but this has never happened exactly like that. There has always been a geopolitical influence of those in the core. And over the years, that geopolitical influence was exercised also by multinational corporations. And more, these multinational corporations are geopolitical actors by themselves. They're not just a sort of ambassador representing the country where they have their headquarters. So Amazon is a geopolitical power exercising and controlling governments around the world to some extent independently of the US, in a coalition with the US government today, clearly, but at the same time, they can exercise their own forms of power, and they're not just always responding to what the US government would expect from them. And how do they do it? How is it? Well, if they install a data center in your country, they will never be sharing that data with the government or with anyone in that country unless it's a business for them to do it. If the US government requests them to send part of the data that is stored there is something called the US Cloud Act that obliges the company to basically share the data with the US government. So there is no security by installing a data center inside a national jurisdiction, that the data will never leave the country or will never be accessed, ultimately in this case, by the US government. Whereas at the same time, having a data center in your territory, it's a way in which the companies are capturing cheap electricity, a lot of water that could be used for other things, more productive in the country, because the data center is not where the digital technologies are physically produced. It is produced online, virtually. So I can be here coding and developing an AI model that will be trained in a data center that is in Siberia. So the fact that the data center is installed here in Argentina doesn't mean that there will be any type of advantage for Argentinian organizations to train their models. And there is no, once the data center is installed, jobs inside a data center, you can count them, there are just a few. It's like the companies themselves even say that per building, they will not be hiring more than 50 employees. And they will be doing mostly technical jobs. So it's not that this old idea of a foreign direct investment where, okay, you get the foreign company in your country. It's not so easy to govern a foreign company, especially for peripheral, semi-peripheral countries, but still, you will get the jobs, you will get things manufactured in your country. This is not at all the case with a data center. If we want to make a comparison with another industry, the data centers are like the mining industry, where the company gets to the mine, extract the minerals, extract whatever they have there, they take it somewhere else, and the result is a further reinforcement of underdevelopment. In this case, what they are extracting is mostly electricity and water. Of course, they are also extracting minerals and rare earth materials. To continue with the example of Argentina, we do have lithium, and it's been extracted in particular by Chinese and for leading corporations like BYD. So these companies are the ones that end up profiting from our nature. So going back to the case of the data centers, installing a data center in a territory like Argentina simply means more nature extractivism that enables more data and more knowledge extractivism, because more data centers today mean that these companies and also those other big companies that use their services to capture data from society will have more spaces to do it. We'll have the possibility to train more AI models that then are not put at the service of solving people's problems, but more often than not put at the service of worsening the problems in our society. And this ranges from using AI for the defense and for defense and warfare, to using AI for surveillance, to using AI for targeted advertisement, to using AI for controlling workers in the workplace. So when asked itself, again, why is it that we would like to have a big tech company data center in our territory? That doesn't advance sovereignty at all. And what could is to actually start developing alternative solutions that are public led. Because again, let's say instead of going back to the example of SAP as a complicit company in all this story, let's say SAP says to the German government, no worries, I'm going to now be the one that installs the data centers in Germany. This by no means will make things any different, in the sense that if one day the German government manages to replace its dependence and the dependence of the German economy on big tech companies and becomes a dependence on SAP for the same things, SAP will be the ruler. And one could say, okay, because it's a German company, it will comply better with the German regulations. To some extent, maybe it pays a bit more taxes, maybe if it has platforms, it will be moderating the content and operating in a way that is less shady. Maybe, let's assume the German government ends up being able to enforce it. But even in the best case scenario, we will still be living under a form of intellectual monopolization for the key technologies of today. And it will still be a private company deciding what type of technology, what type of AI we get, instead of finding solutions that are better for everyone, that put people and the planet first, which would require the technology to be discussed, decided, and the priorities to be defined in public institutions with representatives from different parts of our society. It's not possible to accept that the future of such an important technology is decided behind closed doors by a few actors, be them the US government or the private companies. It simply cannot happen. We need to find ways to create institutions that can decide the priorities, the research priorities, because there is no such a thing as serendipity and this technology coming out of thin air. This is the AI that we have, because this is the AI that reinforces the power of a few giant companies, and secondarily of their satellites, and among them the closest ones, which include SAP, but also include AI startups that like OpenAI, like Anthropic, but also like Mistral. So it's not that through companies from that will be or developing the models or even replacing the cloud dependence on big tech that we will find a solution. I think that we need to find public solutions, and we need to accept that when there is a natural monopoly, the solution the solution that usually tries to promote competition will not work. and because it will not work, because it's better to have a concentrated supermarket where all the technologies can be purchased as a service, that supermarket needs to be public. Otherwise, be the company a US one, a Chinese one, or a German one, or you name it, that company will still be having extraordinary power to control and define who is doing what and how, who profits to what extent, and why inside a huge ecosystem that they control beyond ownership.
But then the question is, okay, even if Chinese regime government, which controls a lot and has this amazing capacity to be omnipresent in public and private life, even if they have decided to delegate these competences, the technical competences, to quasi-commercial spirit of entrepreneurship, rather than do it in a purely kind of centralized fashion. Even in a such kind of disciplined society, let's put it neutrally, society, it proved to be more feasible, more realistic to do it through commercial, public-private partnership.
I
How?
wouldn't call it I wouldn't call it more feasible, because actually the Chinese government simply didn't try to create an alternative. The Chinese government, although for some people it may be hard to see it, but the Chinese government wants China to be a geopolitical power. And it knows that it needs to play by rules that are the capitalist rules. And the Chinese government and is not creating in China something different from capitalism. Of course, it's shaping capitalism to something that is not the same as the way in which capitalism is developed in the US or in the Western world. But that doesn't mean that China is not capitalistic. So I think that the Chinese government never really tried to have a public-led alternative, because it's not part of its purpose. Its purpose is to replace the US as the global superpower in a way.
Okay, so but then
So
the
when
question, yeah,
but
how?
I get your question. Like, is it feasible? Is it possible to develop an alternative? To what extent? How? And how, when more and more organizations are just simply accepting that a US big tech cloud is the better way to develop not only every type of digital technology, but today AI, which is something that everybody wants and everybody is racing for it. And I think that here we need to kind of demystify AI in different ways. First, AI is ultimately just advanced statistics. And second, there are so many promises. It seems that AI is going to save the world. And among all the things that AI will do, AI will also bring economic growth, which is something that for many governments around the world, Europe in particular, is a concern. And the first thing to say there is that this is an exaggerated promise. So when we think of an alternative, we need to leave behind the fact that it's not that by thinking of an alternative, we will miss the promised growth. That promised growth is just a promise. It will be a failed promise, a fake one from the very beginning. There are already forecasts and analysis that show that AI will not bring all this promised economic growth, will these increases in productivity and so on, in part because the type of AI that is being developed is an AI that is aimed at replacing part of the creative tasks that workers are doing, like our job as scholars. Well, in part of the cool part of our job, not the administrative burden associated with it, but the cool part of our job is being pushed to be replaced with AI. And the same happens with journalists, designers, etc. So all this promised growth is really not happening. It's not there. So the first thing to say is that when it comes to the feasibility is that it's not that by trying to develop an alternative, governments will be sacrificing growth, because the growth is not going to come anyway. Second, how to create an alternative that is feasible requires us to think small but with big ambitions. It's impossible to say that we're going to develop a complete alternative to big tech, because these companies invest more than most of the governments on earth. So we need to think strategically. And for that, what I've been advocating for is to start from making governments, making states less dependent. If a government wants to regulate a company, its operations cannot depend on this company. It becomes really complex if, let's say, the CMA uses Microsoft services and then tries to regulate Microsoft. Because what is at stake is not simply a form of clash of power between a regulator and a huge company. It's also that the regulator capacity to regulate depends on the technology of the company that is trying to regulate. So I think that it cannot happen that governments depend for the public administration, for teaching kids at school, for delivering health through the NHS, as the UK government depends today on companies like Microsoft, Palantir, Google, you name it, because these three at least are completely entangled with the UK government's administrations. So the first thing is to concentrate on thinking, okay, we're not going to replace big tech from all the things that they do, but we need a divorce between the technologies used in the public sector and these companies. And this can start small. Instead of saying we're going to eliminate every form of big tech service from every corner of the UK government, this could start with one specific area, healthcare. The NHS cannot have its data used and analyzed with technologies that come from Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Palantir. It simply cannot happen. It cannot happen that the digital services used for treating patients are those of these giant companies. So how can we develop an alternative? For me, the public part of the alternative ecosystem needs to be placed in the segments that are prone to natural monopolization. So if the public sector, and this can be done internationally, it can be done with the whole Europe, this can be done with Latin America, with Africa, with most of Asia, a technical platform where the digital services can, for the state, that will be provided to governments in the specific sector that we are discussing, let's say healthcare, can be developed, exchanged, and consumed. So we need to replace the cloud as the place in which the digital technologies are produced, exchanged, and consumed. This is technically feasible. What should also happen is that the data of the NHS should be stored in a public sector data center. It cannot be stored inside the cloud of any of these companies. Of course, it can be that the public sector uses, let's say, sensors or some other piece of hardware that is rented as a service through that cloud and is private. Okay, as long as the data is not stored there. And the services offered to the healthcare sector in the UK, so to the NHS, can totally be private services. But because the platform in which they will be developed will be a public one, the public sector will be able to say under which conditions it's purchasing the services. And because this alternative ecosystem will be an ecosystem that is public-led for the public sector, demand is assured. And this is another thing that one needs to consider in every form of industrial policy or alternative way of developing technologies. Who's going to use them? Who's going to purchase them? Because otherwise, the alternative system will not work. But if the state is the one that procures and assures procurement to those, whoever wants to offer services there, following the requirements of the public sector, which might be open auditing of the algorithms, not necessarily to make the algorithms open source. In some cases, yes. In some cases, it may accept that they can still be closed and private and that the company can offer it as a service to other governments or to other clients. But the UK government should decide that it will audit the algorithms to make sure that the technology that is receiving is the one that it requests, that it's needed, that those algorithms will not be doing more than what they say they are doing. And the only way to really enforce this type of regulation is if you are the one that is offering this technical layer on top of which the services will be developed. And if you are always in control of your data. So I think that it can start small. And if it starts only for healthcare, it will be way cheaper at the level of the size of the data center that you need, way cheaper in terms of the complexity of the platform that you need to build. And again, it's something that shouldn't be just developed by one government at a time, because the same type of platform for healthcare can be used by every government on earth that has a public healthcare system. So actually, governments around the world should collaborate for developing together these solutions. And collaboration is fundamental. International collaboration is fundamental for many reasons, not only because it makes it cheaper, but also because it makes it better for the planet, because you minimize the ecological footprint of these technologies by sharing them. And at the same time, you develop some safeguards that prevent the public capture, that prevent that one government, one authoritarian government, which is a probably likely scenario, given all the failures of labor and the fact that they are definitely not governing for labor, but governing for a few in the UK today. A likely scenario, unfortunately, in the UK is that there will be a far-right government in the short future. Let's say this solution is developed and a far-right government wants to either terminate it or wants to capture it and use it for its own benefits. This needs to be, of course, forbidden, but it's not just forbidding it by law. There needs to be a way in which one can reassure that it will not be captured in the way that, let's say, Milei government in Argentina would be capturing it if Argentina had such a solution. And for me, this is why, and we say it with other colleagues in this report that we wrote, Reclaiming Digital Sovereignty, making it international is also a way to prevent authoritarian capture of these alternatives. So all in all, I think that this is neither extremely expensive nor technically complex, because we're not discussing here about having the latest AI model. It's also about leaving behind this AI race and thinking more in terms of what the problems are and how can we put technology at the service of solving problems. And for doing that, we need to recognize that every technology is political, that how we develop it, what is developed, comes from political decisions. How an AI model is created is full of political decisions being made by the companies in terms of how the model will operate, what type of parameters the model will have, what data will be used for training it. These are critical decisions. So we need to start building technology, at least for the public sector, where these critical decisions are not being made by a few private actors or a few people that may that be from even the public sector, but still the problem is how to democratize this decision-making process. So part of the solution also comes from recognizing that these decisions and the advancement and development of digital technologies needs to be guided by what for me looks like a new digital science and technology agency. It can be an international agency, and it should be governed not only by computer scientists, but also it should be interdisciplinary. It should have people that are experts in the ecological impact of these technologies, in the ethical impacts, the economic, political, and it should also have representation from unions, because these technologies are impacting labor, not only by replacing labor, but also by transforming what being a journalist, being a designer, being a researcher means. They are further reinforcing the separation between conception and execution. So when we are deciding what type of technologies will be developed, what type of technologies the state in this case will use, we also need to think about what impact the development of these technologies will have, in this case, on physicians, because we were talking, or healthcare workers, because we were talking about healthcare, but it can also be public servants more in general. So what impact will this type of technology have on workers? And therefore, we need representation from the unions also in these agencies defining the type of technology that we will have. So this is why, going back to what I was saying in the beginning, I think this is a discussion about democracy and how to make societies more democratic. The public sector is critical for this, but we cannot just accept the public sectors that we have today. We need to make them more democratic, and in order to do it, we need to create new institutions that have representation of those being impacted by these technologies, as well as by those developing the technologies, and those that understand what, going back to one of your first questions, what is at stake? And this requires interdisciplinarity as well.
You have several affiliations to Chile, and one of those which I know best is the UCL, which is an institution of its own right, and it's such an impactful university, shaping minds and agenda in so many different areas. But within the UCL, you are also a member of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which is yet another very impactful group of people. Uh, so my question is how your ideas are connected into the kind of plans of the institute. Do you consolidate? Do you coordinate? Because if it's a little bit kind of Don Quixotean, if you are only on your own, however impactful and appealing the messages are, you need a team in order to make some changes. that's the first part, a significant part of the question. And another one, the recipients. Is your message being heard by public authorities? Do you see that they're just doing just pro forma nodding, or they really take it seriously? Tell us about this part as well.
Sure. So I would say that my networks go also beyond IIPP, my institute, because I've been collaborating with like-minded people from I would say more than a dozen countries in the world, and certainly more than that, because from different countries in Latin America, in Europe, also in the US, in Canada. And this includes not only scholars, but also includes people from the public sector. But going back to the question about the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, honestly, I couldn't think of a better place to be for developing this agenda. I think that our institute is precisely about rethinking the state. And how can we make states more democratic, more up to the task? And what is the role of the public sector in building a better society for everyone, one that lives within planetary boundaries? So I ultimately think that what I'm doing is at the heart of what is relevant for our institute, and I had all the liberty to work on these topics, and actually also inside our institute, part of our PhD students, part of my colleagues also work on related topics and complementary angles. So definitely it is a place to be. And we teach also, we teach a master's in public administration. So we are not just creating the ideas, but also we are training the people that are working in the public sector or want to work in the public sector, and with a completely alternative master's in public administration that doesn't follow the new public management neoliberal ways of training public servants, but really it's a space where we share our research, where we share our understanding of how important the public sector is, but also how we need to change it. And in terms of the public sector from around the world, I would say that there is a lot of interest, and a lot of people from the public sector in different parts of the world are listening, but it's very complex. It's very complex because today, even spaces like the UN are in danger and are being captured by corporate interests, let alone the corporate interests of big tech companies. So I was recently, for instance, in Brazil, discussing with a lot of people from the Brazilian government, just to name one example that I know that makes the headlines, because Brazil has been at the forefront in trying to say no to these companies and stopping them when they are not complying with the constitution, with law. And I think that Brazil is doing very well in certain respects. It's trying through its antitrust authority, CADE, to have a special regime for big tech companies, platform companies, not only from the US, like every big tech company, and trying to prevent them from reinforcing their intellectual monopolies and finding solutions to open up this enclosure of digital assets that they are constantly reinforcing and exercising. But this still needs to be approved by the Congress, and it's not a given. So there are always internal conflicts inside public administrations, and that includes as well other parts of the Brazilian government. So, for instance, in the finance ministry, the Brazilian government has been through the finance ministry has implemented Redata. Redata is a special regime for data centers. And unfortunately, it's a way to attract more nature extractivism. And even if the government has tried to make it less extractive, in the end of the day, it's definitely not working as such, because they are even given tax exemptions to these companies. I am sorry, I got distracted by my nephew. If there is one thing that distracts me in my life, that's my nephew. But just to finish what I was saying, Redata is the way in which the Brazilian government tried to become more sovereign by getting the data in its country, but also getting the foreign direct investment of these companies. But because of all the reasons that we were discussing before, it's simply not working. It's backfiring. It's actually making the government more dependent on these companies. So these are examples of the internal conflicts, and how more than ever is needed to have public alternatives, public-led alternatives. It's not that then the companies promise that they will do more, like use more renewable energy. Although it's impossible to run a data center fully with renewable energy, let's say one day it is, is this the best use of your renewable energy? I was telling you, I was in Brazil. I think definitely they need a better public transport system, and they need one that is run only on renewables. So definitely, if they have a lot of renewable energy, let's use it for that instead of using it for more concentration of intangibles in the hands of a few big tech companies. So I think that it's complex. It's not easy to see how my message is being received, because definitely they receive the message and they understand and they share the concerns. But then governments around the world, as I was saying, are often trapped with this growth mantra, thinking that they need to growth at every cost, because it is through economic growth that, in the case of Brazil, they will achieve development. And what they end up doing is forgetting about discussing what development means, because they never grow at enough. They are always facing the international forms of subordination and dependency. And because they never grow, they never discuss about development, and what they do good to the people in one respect sometimes is completely undermined by other policies. So I think that more than ever, this is an ecosystem. What we started discussing, that digital is a network, that digital is an ecosystem, we also need ecosystemic regulations. We also need regulations that talk to each other. It cannot happen that CADE is developing a way to control more these companies, and the finance ministry is inviting them more to capture more nature from Brazil and to become even stronger in the world by capturing data and knowledge. Because even the Redata invites the companies to work together with universities, as if the companies were going to transfer any type of knowledge to universities. It's the other way around. They're going to appropriate more of the public research, public knowledge developed in Brazil. So definitely that's not the way forward. And I think that a way to identify these contradictions is by helping the government, the different parts of the government, to talk more to each other and be less siloed. And this is not easy, but I think it's still something that we must do. And sometimes the message arrives, but also these companies have huge lobbyists that are directly coming from the companies or indirectly through even scholars, think tanks. So although the network is big in terms of the people that want to build an alternative to big tech, to intellectual monopolization, we are not the most powerful companies in the world. They are. So I think that there is much more to be done, and it's still to be seen, although the window of political opportunity is very thin and is closing as we speak. So there is no time to lose.
One last question before reverting to your plans and recommendation to students. There is a jurisdiction in the world where the growth agenda is of less impact and visibility and somehow influence the European Union. And because it's primarily for member states to deal with growth, the raison d'etre of European Union is to create a single market, essentially. Yeah? So they are less preoccupied with this complicating rhetorics of growth or obsession with growth. They are more, they could be more pragmatic with building the European or liberating itself from dependency or making it Europe more resilient. And it looks that we are in the European Union at the stage where there are several initiatives, quite mature, serious initiatives, overcoming the stage of just spontaneous kind of let's replicate, let's copy paste. And they are already on the track of trying to put forward some serious solutions for Europe.
Let me say two things
Are you
about.
optimistic about it? And do you think where should they focus?
I think I'm not. If anything, I'm more optimistic about Brazil or Uruguay than of the European Union, unfortunately. First of all, with the Drago report, Letta report, they're all about competitiveness. They are all about the mantra of growth. So unfortunately, although the aim was to build a more integrated space, which often was just reduced to a single market, the economy, the world is more than just markets. So I think that one of the things that Europe is missing is that they wanted a single market without thinking in terms of wanting a better society for every European. And I think that that should be the priority. And when you think about that, you need to also connect it to the contradictions of the European Commission. Because it's true that the European Commission is concerned about sovereignty, but at the same time, they are watering down the implementation of the AI Act. So their regulations to make sure that these companies were extracting less, were developing technologies in a way that was a bit less harmful. They are simply not going to use it. So this is why I'm quite disappointed about the European Commission. I know that for some parliamentarians, this is also a huge disappointment, in particular from the left, from the Social and Democrats, or more than a disappointment. I mean, we knew that an European Commission controlled by the far right and the right was not going to make good to the people. And we are seeing it. We are seeing it more and more. Because the way in which they are concerned about sovereignty is an old-style way of being concerned about sovereignty. Is let's have our own tech giants. Let's have our Eurostack that is simply private companies, but from Europe. And if we just replace where it says US for European companies, it will be better. The answer is no, it will not be better. Technologically, even probably it will not be able to work, but even if it does, it will replicate the same logics. So really, it's not going to develop technology in the way that solves people's problems, a technology that is vigilant of its ecological footprint and where what technology is produced and how it's decided, taking into account planetary boundaries. None of that will happen. It's just giving the power to a few European companies, and in particular companies coming from a few European countries. If they want to build something that is more European, this needs to be public. This needs to be public-led. Again, you can have the companies then operating in the market space, but it's not that by replacing the dependence on data centers and cloud from Amazon and now depending on SAP, things will be any better. So I think that although some people even from the right at the European Commission understood that there is a problem with their dependence on big tech, they are still, one, usually bending the knee to the US and these companies, even if at the same time they say that they are concerned about sovereignty, and two, they still see sovereignty as a matter of nationality, and they don't see sovereignty as a matter of governance and making our society more democratic one. And this is what we can expect because they are the far right. So definitely they don't want more democracy or better democracies. They want more authoritarian governments, and they want to be in charge, and they want to be as if they were the US government. So definitely that will not be a solution for Europe, for the Europeans.
Okay, but let us. The second part of the question was which sector should we focus at? You mentioned cloud in the broader sense. Should it be also, I don't know, chip manufacturing or it's?
I think that one needs to start from what is feasible, and what is feasible today is to have your own cloud, the cloud part, but still in terms of the physical part, you still need to buy NVIDIA GPUs. It's impossible to, from today to tomorrow, produce at that level. If Europe wants to have a chip industry, this requires long-term planning. It only takes a second to look at what China has been done. China has been planning the industry for decades now. So it's not something that will be happening anytime soon. Should Europe then accept that it cannot design or manufacture chips? No, not at all. It can have a long-term industrial policy for the development of the sector. But in the meantime, it will need to be buying, and if it buys as a single economic space chips from NVIDIA, it will get a better deal than if each and every government is trying to negotiate separated deals, or organizations are trying to negotiate a separated deal. So I think that is also about what is feasible. We start from among the critical parts where it's feasible, and it's impossible to do it all. This is the other part. It's very easy to write a long list of recommendations where you say, and Europe needs to lead in cloud computing, in quantum computing, in the development of the models, in the satellites, in the chips, and you continue. And then who's going to pay for all that? Who is really going to do it? And if you try to do a bit of everything, it will fail. So you need to identify which are the critical segments where you can have your alternative and then focus there, because there are many critical segments, and definitely having like alternatives to NVIDIA when it comes to designing GPUs would be critical. It is so critical that even Amazon, Microsoft, and Google have designed their own semiconductors to have alternatives to NVIDIA and negotiate better deals with NVIDIA. So, of course, it's relevant to be capable of designing frontier semiconductors. But what I'm saying here is this critical need will take decades to master. In the meantime, you cannot just wait. And if you really want to do it right, you need to invest from today and be patient. But in the meantime, there are things that you can do with the capabilities that you already have in Europe, with the scientists and engineers that you already have in Europe, in the public sector, some working from companies that could be attracted to work on developing this alternative public cloud for the public sector. That on top of which you can have European companies and companies from around the world offering digital services to the public sector in one specific area. So we start small. It's still small, but it's very ambitious because it's creating a completely alternative ecosystem that responds, in this case, if we think of healthcare or education, that responds to the need of that sector in order to make it better for the public good. And I think this focus on the public purpose of the development of technology is fundamental. We shouldn't be thinking about winning a race. We need to be thinking about producing better technologies, technologies that work for people, technologies that solve problems, technologies that inspire better ways of living. So it's not just about producing applied technologies. It's also about how we prioritize the development of science and technology that ultimately ends up being public and good for people and the planet.
I ask often the guests I have pleasure to speak with about their plans, but I think in this case it's quite self-evident. You will continue implementing
Well,
this.
I continue doing research on these topics. One of the focuses of my research at the moment refers to public capture, different ways in which the public sector around the world, in particular in Europe, also in Latin America, but also how I'm trying to identify all the reasons why, even if governments want to do right, they end up doing wrong in a way. And the concrete ways in which their dependence on big tech companies and the US is being exercised. So it's not only about their technological dependencies, but it's also about regulatory capture, it's also about the capture of narratives. And this is one of the areas that I'm interested in at the moment. But at the same time, I continue doing research on how these technologies govern and control others. So trying to identify the different ways in which they, for instance, capture talent and how they are managing to turn collectively created knowledge into their assets. So that also continues being a priority of my research, if you want. And also trying to see more and more how other sectors are becoming subordinated to these digital technologies and what impact digital technologies have on labor, which I think is an area where outside the mainstream, there are just like very few contributions. One, of course, is the book The Eye of the Master by Matteo Pasquinelli. There are others like an expanded Taylorism, something like that is a book in French that Sebastian Carbonell has recently published. But I think that is still, because I have some differences, and I agree with some of their ideas and I also have some differences. I think there is more research that needs to be done into connecting how generative AI is affecting our capacities to think. We see this already in some neuroscience papers, but I think that we need to understand it better in the workplace and concretely how it is affecting workers. So that's also part of my future research plan.
And recommendation to students.
Recommendation to students in terms of what to read or what to work on or everything. I
How to
think
survive and
critically.
how to
If
advance.
it's a broad question, yeah, I would say you need to continue cultivating your capacity to think critically. And to do this, you cannot rely on the generative AI for the ideation, for the answer of your questions. I'm Argentinian. I use sometimes generative AI to double check my English. But I first write the answers myself and I think about the answers myself. So one thing is to make the generative AI your fact checker and ask the generative AI to improve what you've done. And the other thing is for you to become the fact checker of the generative AI because you will stop thinking eventually. And if you don't learn how to think critically, how to connect ideas, how not to accept the first answer that you get, especially when something sounds incomplete, how to build more cohesive understandings of the world. And also, my other recommendation would be to always remember that science, research, they are political. And those that tell you otherwise and that say that they are neutral, they are hiding behind their research. They're hiding their political interests, their political orientations behind the research. Why I ask myself certain questions cannot be detached from the fact that I'm an Argentinian that studied economics after the 2001 crisis in Argentina, that comes from a middle income family that at certain moments in time faced certain hardships, that I studied at the University of Buenos Aires, a public university, that then I continued my career in France and after that in the UK, and where I was and the people that I met and the things that I read. All this shapes my understanding of things, and all this influences how, and all the concerns that I have about the world influence the way in which I ask myself questions. That doesn't mean that I will come and say something that is false. It means that in the ways in which we do research, the methods that we use, the questions that we ask, we are inevitably introducing our social being because we are the producers of knowledge. So never believe those that tell you that science, that innovation is neutral, because they're hiding things from you, and being critical is also necessary for identifying what they're hiding and why.
Cecilia Rikap, thank you very much for sharing your ideas with us.
Thank you, Alice. Take care.